This offseason has been frustrating for many Arizona Cardinals fans. Many fans were going into free agency expecting the Cardinals to make some big moves, but none of those big splash signings occurred. Instead, we got budget signings like Will Hernandez and Nick Vigil, and this left many Cardinals fans frustrated. They were watching other teams in the division sign bigger names and felt like this team was lagging behind. But as time has gone on, the Cardinals have made a steady stream of small moves, some good draft picks, a couple of interesting trades, and now I think we're left with this question of, is this Cardinals team better than the one we had a year ago? I'm going to try to answer that question by going position by position and comparing the Cardinals roster as it stands now to that which the Cardinals had going into the 2021 season. Now, before I get into the analysis, let me just make a couple disclaimers. Rosters at this time of year are very fluid. There are players on the Cardinals roster right now who might not even be on the roster in week one, as well as players on the practice squad who might get called up week to week to play. And then there's also the matter of injured players and players like DeAndre Hopkins, who's suspended right now. So in order to address these kinds of things, I'm going to make what I think are some reasonable allowances, both in terms of looking at this year's roster and the roster from last year. For example, players like Justin Pugh and Robert Alford weren't actually on the active roster at this point last year because they were both out with COVID. But I am going to include them as part of last year's roster because they were eventually added to the active roster and were key players last year. I'm also going to include on the roster players who are on the injured reserve or suspended, who we expect should be back in the first half of the season. But I'm not going to include players like Marquise Hayes, who was placed on season-ending injured reserve. There's a few other allowances I'm going to make for both seasons, and I'll discuss these as I go through the position groups. So let's dive in and start with the quarterbacks. Now, as a note, when we go through these position groups, I'm going to highlight the starters in green and depth players in yellow. Now, obviously, our number 1 and 2 quarterbacks haven't changed from last year to this year, Kyler Murray and Colt McCoy. Our third string quarterback has changed from Chris Streveler to Trace McSorley. Although the Cardinals added McSorley off of the Ravens practice squad mid-season last year, I'm doing this comparison based on the beginning of the season. Now, although one could make the argument that the version of Kyler Murray we're going to get this year might be better than last year because of one more year of experience, I'm going to go ahead and count the starting quarterback position as a tie, a position where we haven't seen a significant upgrade or downgrade. As far as backups, I'm also going to count that as a tie. Colt McCoy is still Colt McCoy, and one might argue McSorley is better than Streveler, but I think it's close enough or at least uncertain enough that I'm going to go ahead and treat the backups as also a tie between both years. Next, we have running backs. Now, I'm going with 2 starters here because the Cardinals do seem to like to use a committee with 2 running backs, both getting a significant number of touches. Now, obviously, James Conner is the constant here, but Chase Edmonds moved on, signed with Miami Dolphins, and Eno Benjamin is listed as the number 2 running back on the depth chart. Now, it's possible Darrell Williams ends up getting some of those snaps, but for the time being, we're going to go with Eno Benjamin as that number 2. Now, although I have high hopes for how Benjamin is going to perform, and Cliff Kingsbury has been raving about him in this preseason, I am going to give the advantage to last year's running back duo because Chase Edmonds was more proven. Now, when you look at backups, in 2021, the Cardinals had Eno Benjamin and Jonathan Ward, and this year they have Darrell Williams, Jonathan Ward, and Keontae Ingram. Now, although Eno Benjamin again has made steps and is looking like he's going to be one of those starters this year, I still think that the depth this year is better than that of last year. Darrell Williams is a solid veteran who's played well in this league, and Keontae Ingram is a promising rookie who adds even more depth. So altogether, I give the nod in terms of depth to the 2022 roster. Now we get to tight ends. Now, obviously, the Cardinals traded for Zach Ertz mid-season, but they started out the season with Max Williams as the starter. Zach Ertz, the starting tight end this year, is definitely an upgrade. So in terms of starters, the advantage clearly goes to this season. And in terms of backups, last season we had Darrell Daniels and Demetrius Harris. This year, we have last year's starter Max Williams, second-round pick Trey McBride, and veteran Steven Anderson, who's a solid special teams contributor and a nice depth piece. So the depth also gets the clear nod in 2022. This tight end room is much better than it was last year, and to be frank, this is the best group of tight ends I've ever seen on the Cardinals roster. Next, we go to wide receivers. Now again, I know DeAndre Hopkins is out for 6 games with a suspension, but I'm going to go ahead and include him on the roster because he's a player the Cardinals anticipate should be here down the stretch and when it matters, hopefully in the playoffs. So when you compare the starting receivers, you have DeAndre Hopkins both seasons and AJ Green both seasons, but the real difference is swapping out Christian Kirk for Hollywood Brown. Now, some might argue these two are close, but I am going to give the edge to Hollywood Brown. As much as I like Christian Kirk, I think Hollywood Brown has more upside. He's got a 1,000-yard season under his belt, and as much as Christian Kirk was fast in his own right, Hollywood Brown is even faster. And you could also argue, if you wanted, that AJ Green should be more effective with another year in the system. So overall, I'm going to give a slight edge to this year's starting receivers. Now, when you look at depth, you have three of the same players: Rondale Moore, Antoine Wesley, and Andy Isabella, but you also add to that Greg Dortch, who had a solid preseason and has looked good every time he's had a chance to touch the ball. And Rondale Moore is going into his second year and should be a bigger part of the offense. And Andy Isabella also seems to be trending in the right direction in terms of his play. So overall, I am going to give the depth advantage to the 2022 receiving room as well. Next, let's look at the offensive line. In terms of starters, there's a lot of continuity here. Left tackles DJ Humphries both years, Justin Pugh returns at left guard, Rodney Hudson at center, Calvin Beachum at right tackle. The one change here is that Josh Jones is replaced by Will Hernandez. Josh Jones struggled mightily at right guard last year, and that was largely due to the fact that he was played out of position. He is a tackle by trade. Will Hernandez, on the other hand, is a starting guard. That is his natural position. So while Will Hernandez did struggle the last couple of years in New York, I do think he's a clear upgrade at that right guard position. And after being reunited with his college coach, Sean Kugler, I think he's going to have a resurgence and have an outstanding year at right guard. So I'm going to give the nod to this year's starting offensive line as being better than that of last year. Now, when we look at the depth, last year we had Joshua Miles, Justin Murray, Brian Winters, though he was cut shortly after the start of the season, Max Garcia, and Sean Harlow. Now this season, Josh Jones has been moved back to his natural position of tackle and will be the team's swing tackle. And during the preseason, Josh Jones was outstanding. And I think right now, he is a starting caliber tackle who we're going to have as our backup tackle. Then you have Cody Ford, who the Cardinals traded for, who hasn't quite lived up to his draft status as a second rounder, but has a lot of starts at both guard and tackle. He's going to be our primary backup guard and probably is going to start some games here and there as players are out with injuries. Then we have Sean Harlow as our backup center, who can also play guard, and Lasita Smith, the rookie, who is also a player who can play guard or some center. Overall, I like this year's depth better. I think Josh Jones is a better backup tackle than we had last year, and Cody Ford is a better backup guard than anyone we had last year. Obviously, Sean Harlow is a constant, and Brian Winters wasn't really part of the roster beyond a week or two into the season anyway. And as much as Max Garcia had some struggles, he does have more experience than Lasita Smith, so maybe he has a slight advantage over the rookie at this point. But based on the strength of Josh Jones and Cody Ford, I'm going to give the edge to this year's depth. Next up are our interior defensive linemen. Now, two of our starters are the same, J.J. Watt and Zach Allen. But last year, Corey Peters was the starting nose tackle, whereas Rashard Lawrence is slated to be the starter this year. Now, I'm quite bullish on Rashard Lawrence. I think he looked really good against the run last year, and I think he's going to be a solid player for us if he can stay healthy. But Corey Peters was a solid veteran who played really well for the Cardinals. And for the time being, I am going to give the advantage to the 2021 starting defensive interior line, primarily based on the fact that Peters did have more experience. Now, in terms of depth last year, the Cardinals had Jordan Phillips, Rashard Lawrence, Leki Fotu, and Michael Dogbe. This year, they have Michael Dogbe, Jonathan Ledbetter, and Leki Fotu. So because Fotu and Dogbe are constants here, we really have to ask, is Jonathan Ledbetter better than Jordan Phillips and Rashard Lawrence combined in terms of depth? Well, you already heard what I think of Lawrence. I think he's an outstanding player. And as much as Cardinals fans were down on Jordan Phillips, he was actually one of our better defensive linemen last year. Of course, with how our defensive linemen play, that's not a terribly high bar. And although Jonathan Ledbetter did look good this preseason, I am going to have to give the edge to the 2021 depth. Now we're going to move on to outside linebackers. Last season, the Cardinals had Chandler Jones and Marcus Golden starting. This season, based on the depth chart, it looks like it's going to be Marcus Golden and Dennis Gardeck. But it is worth noting, I think the Cardinals are going to rotate a lot of players in and out at this position. But when we compare these starters, we have to give the advantage to last year's starting outside linebackers, Chandler Jones and Marcus Golden. Now, I know Chandler Jones had one big game and it felt like he really didn't do much for the rest of the season, but he is still one of the best pass rushers in this league. Now, when we look at depth, this gets a little tricky to me. The Cardinals had Devin Kennard, Dennis Gardeck, and Victor Dimukeje last year. Now, this year, the Cardinals still have Victor Dimukeje, but he looked dominant this preseason. And yes, I know it's against third stringers and second stringers, but if a player looks dominant against those players, then to me, that looks like he's a starting caliber player. And he wasn't nearly as good last preseason. So to me, it feels like Victor Dimukeje has taken a step forward. Now, the Cardinals don't have Devin Kennard on their active roster this year, but he is on their practice squad. And I wouldn't wouldn't be surprised if he gets activated on some game days. So although I don't have him on this list for the 2022 depth players, I do think it's reasonable to take into account that he's on the practice squad and is available as part of this depth if they so choose. Now, they've moved Dennis Gardeck into that starting role, so he's no longer part of their depth. But to this year's depth, they added a couple promising rookies in Myjai Sanders and Cameron Thomas. Now, Thomas struggled in the preseason, but Sanders looked pretty good. And all things taken into account, I feel like this year's depth is better than that of last year. Next, we get into inside linebackers. This one's also a little bit tricky. Last year's starters were Isaiah Simmons and Jordan Hicks, whereas this year's starters are slated to be Isaiah Simmons and Zaven Collins. Now, in terms of the argument for 2021, Jordan Hicks is a veteran linebacker who knows the defense and was a pretty steady player for the Cardinals. But when you look at the 2022 starters, you could make an argument that although Zaven Collins doesn't have the experience of Hicks, and although he struggled last year and things have been a little rough for him this preseason, he has some physical tools that Jordan Hicks simply doesn't have. Everything for Zaven Collins has been about getting up to speed with the defense and staying healthy. He was banged up some last year. But when Collins has been in there, he's flashed. He's shown some physicality that Jordan Hicks just doesn't have at this point in his career. And Hicks did have some struggles against the run and with his first step on plays. One could make an argument for either direction here, so I'm going to treat these starters as a tie. Hicks had more experience, but Collins has more tools and more potential. Now, when we get to the backups, we had Zaven Collins, Tanner Vallejo, and Ezekiel Turner last year. This year, we have Nick Vigil, Tanner Vallejo, Ben Niemann, and Ezekiel Turner. With Vallejo and Turner as constants, the real question is, do Vigil and Niemann offer the Cardinals better depth this year than Collins did last year? And as much as I'm a believer in Collins, and I think he's going to have a good year this season, Nick Vigil is an experienced starter, and Ben Niemann has experience playing at the NFL level. So while they don't have the same tools as Collins, the fact that you have two players with legitimate NFL playing experience to fall back on if you need it gives the depth advantage to the 2022 roster. Next up, we have cornerback. This is another tricky one. Last year, the starters were Robert Alford, Byron Murphy Jr., and Marco Wilson. Now this year, the Cardinals starters project to be Trayvon Mullen, Byron Murphy Jr., and Antonio Hamilton when he returns from the non-football injury list. Now, although Trayvon Mullen, this year's starting cornerback, has a lot of upside and potential, Robert Alford graded really well last year, and I would say has an advantage, at least at this point, in terms of his track record. Now, when you're comparing Marco Wilson to Antonio Hamilton, Hamilton graded better than Marco Wilson did last year and had surpassed him on the depth chart this preseason. So I think that Robert Alford has, at least at this point, an advantage over Trayvon Mullen in this comparison, but Antonio Hamilton has an advantage over Marco Wilson. So I'm going to treat that as a wash and call the starting cornerbacks a tie right now. And when we talk about depth, in 2021, the Cardinals started the season with Tay Gowan and Luke Barku as their backups. But I'm including Antonio Hamilton on the 2021 roster because although he wasn't on the 53-man roster to start the season, between being called up from the practice squad and eventually signed to the 53-man roster, he actually played in all 17 games last year. I'm going to compare that to this year's depth, which includes Marco Wilson, Javelin Guidry, and rookie Christian Matthew. Now, although Antonio Hamilton did play well for the Cardinals last year, this year's depth has much more playing experience than last year's. Javelin Guidry alone has 3 times as many NFL snaps as Tay Gowan and Luke Barku combined, and played really well for the Jets in his rookie season. And although Marco Wilson has struggled, he also has quite a few snaps under his belt. Now, Christian Matthew is a rookie who has not played in the NFL other than preseason. He's got a lot of potential, but he's still unproven. All things considered, I am going to give the depth advantage to the 2022 cornerbacks. Next up, we have safeties. Now, the starters haven't changed. The dynamic duo of Budda Baker and Jalen Thompson were the starters last year, and they are again this year. So I'm going to give that obviously a tie. Now, in terms of depth, the Cardinals have some of the same players, Deontay Thompson, Charles Washington, but there's a couple things I'm going to take into account here when weighing this. Charles Washington, although he did start the season on the roster, was placed on the injured reserve. Now, it is a short-term injured reserve, so they can bring him back after 4 games. But for the 2021 season, I'm also including Chris Banjo. This is a situation very much like the Antonio Hamilton situation last year. He wasn't on the active roster to start the season, but he was on the practice squad and ended up playing in 16 games last season. So taking all this into account, I am going to give the depth advantage to the 2021 roster. Finally, we get to special teams. This one's simple. It's all the same people. We're going to give it a tie. So now that we've done that position by position breakdown, let's take a look at the summary and see how these two rosters compare. Here you see all the check marks lined up by position groups. the green ones for the starters, and the yellow ones for the backups. Now, overall, both years had 8 green check marks, meaning that overall the starting lineups are roughly comparable from one year to the next. But in terms of depth, there seems to be a clear advantage to the 2022 roster, 8 check marks compared to 3. But let's break it down a little bit more by offense versus defense. When you compare the starting units, you see that there's been a shift. This team has improved its offensive starters, but taken a step back in terms of its defensive starters. And when you take into account that one of those check marks for offense was a tie at quarterback, the only offensive position group where last year's roster had an advantage with the starters was running back. Now, in terms of defense and special teams, defensive interior and outside linebacker are the only 2 positions where it seems that the Cardinals were better last year in terms of starters than they are this year. But when you look at that depth, the 2022 Cardinals seem to be much deeper in terms of offensive depth and at least somewhat deeper in terms of defensive depth. So the question remains, is the 2022 Cardinals roster better than the one they started with last season? And I'm going to say it is, on 2 counts. First, this team is deeper than it was last year. And that's important because one of the key things that contributed to the Cardinals' slide last year was injuries. And if they have more roster depth, they're going to be better able to withstand those injuries. The second reason is because this team, although it took a little bit of a step back in terms of its starting defense, made improvements on offense, which really is the name of the game in the NFL. Defense matters, but there are a lot of teams who have gone far in the playoffs and even won Super Bowls with really good offenses and patchwork defenses that got the job done. And if this offense can be better than it was last year, or at least sustain itself better through injuries, this Cardinals team could go places, but they have to prove it on the field. So what do you think? Do you think this Cardinals roster is better? Do you think they're deeper than they were last year? Let me know in the comments below. Also, please be sure to click like on this video and subscribe to my channel if you're a Cardinals fan. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Cardinal Rule.